Good evening. Welcome to this conversation between two eminent scholars of the Middle East. I'm Madeleine Doby from the French department and the Institute for Comparative Literature and Society. So Jean-Pierre Filiu, who is a historian and Arabist, is professor of Middle East Studies at Sciences Po. So this evening we are here primarily to discuss Jean-Pierre Filiu's latest book, titled Les Arabes, leur destin et le nôtre, histoire d'une libération. So if I translate very literally, the Arabs, their destiny and ours, history of a liberation or of an emancipation, published by La Découverte, a book that was has been the winner of the Prix Augustin Thierry in a French historical award. This book is a sweeping history of the Arab world, from the moment of Bonaparte's Egyptian expedition to the present. It looks at relations between Europe, especially France, and the Arab world, though it's much more multilateral in its approach than any kind of a colonial history. I think it's a book with a number of different objectives, one of which is to redress a kind of saturated media image of the Arab world as simply a conglomeration of authoritarian regimes, violence and terrorism and so forth, by focusing on the history of the Nahda, or the Enlightenment in the Arab world, both as a moment in 19th century history and as an ongoing current, an ongoing thread in intellectual, political, and social history. As someone whose work is more focused on Al-Maghreb, I particularly appreciate Jean-Pierre's effort to think in a single frame these connections between Europe, France, the Middle East, and North Africa, since North Africa is often left out of Middle East scholarship, though with recent events that clearly has changed. So with that short introduction, let me ask Jean-Pierre to speak a little bit about the book, and then we'll open to a discussion.
Well, thank you very much, Madeleine. Thank you so much, Rachid, for being here tonight. Thank you all. For me, it's not only a pleasure and an honor, but it's a very emotional moment, because 5 years ago, in this very SIPA school, in the school at Columbia, we were living together the beginning of what has been called then the Arab Spring and what I still call the Arab Revolution. And this 5-year cycle, we see today how unaccomplished it is, but at the same time how strong it is, because the momentum is still very strong. I mean, there is two readings of what is happening these days in Tunisia. Either to say, well, you know, it's back to start, because this is in the very region where the revolution started 5 years ago, that you have now a sweeping social protest with even a youngster, a young unemployed youngster, being electrocuted on an electric pole next to the very place where this tragedy fueled the revolution 5 years ago. So in a non-historical vision, one could say, well, what was the use of all this hope? But historians know that history is tragic. History is moving forward, and history is certainly not a click on Facebook, no matter how much those moments have been described as Facebook revolution by people who didn't grasp at that time how deep was the social and popular upheaval against this Nizam, so at the same time the regime and the system that the people wanted to topple, because the signature slogan of this movement was "Sha'ab yurid isqat an-nizam." The people want to topple the regime. He doesn't want the regime to fall. He wants to topple the regime, which is the very definition of a revolution. But of course, you know, Westerners often consider they have a property right on revolution and other historical categories, and that they are the only one who can deliver the certificate of a true revolution, which was often seen among other manifestations by the fact that the Thawra, which is literally the revolution in Arabic, was translated by revolt. Like, you know, Arabs can rebel, they can be upset, they can revolt, but they cannot do a proper revolution. As though something like a revolution was the monopoly of the northern shore of the Mediterranean. So you have this cycle. And of course, I'm coming from a country that has been hit very hard by jihadi terror 2 months ago. And I'm still, like all my fellow citizens, under this shock. But I try to live through this in a positive, I wouldn't say militant, but certainly a proactive approach. And I just, and I want to share that with you, I've just learned that a debate I had to participate in about this book next week in Paris has been cancelled for security reasons, which makes me really mad. And I can tell you that if I would have been in Paris that evening, I would have been calling everybody to say we should never, 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 never cancel an intellectual debate for security reasons. We just have to get our act together. It's obviously the worst victory we can concede to those forces by stopping, you know, this kind of public discussions. Anyway, when I embarked into this project, and you know, this is my shortest book, but this is the one that demanded most efforts. And it was a proposal by La Découverte publisher, Hugues Jalon, who had earned me at École Normale Supérieure. They had a cycle called Conférence Ernest conferences, debates, and you have only 15 minutes. And in 15 minutes, I try to portray the cycle of revolution, renaissance, resistance, and of course on the other side, colonial oppression, interference, invasions, and on the domestic side, dictature, authoritarian regimes, to say the least, how they would suppress this movement. And he asked me, okay, I heard you doing that for 15 minutes, try to make it 1 hour, maybe 1 hour and a half, and make it a book. And in fact, it was really exhausting endeavor, because he rejected 1/3 of my first manuscript, and I had to go on 3 times, 4 times, because every time he was saying, no, this is not fluid enough, this is too, you're talking with big words, I want simpler words, and you know, it's sometimes much more difficult to use simpler words than big words. Anyway, so this is the result, and what happened is that this book went out end of August, but and he lived its life as an academic contribution to the comprehension of the Arab world, but the terror attacks gave him an incredible boost, which of course nurtured mixed feelings in me, because I felt like a vulture, you know, after this tragedy. But at the same time, I was happy that people would read that book and not the racist, Islamophobic crap that is now, you know, blooming everywhere on the terrain of jihadi terror in France, but in the rest of Europe. So this book was called a phenomenon by, you know, the professionals of publishing at that time, and it was one of the 2 or 3 books that people asked for after the terror attacks. So in a way, I felt rewarded for the work, and I embarked on at least 2-3 times a week, you know, public debates, town hall meetings, whoever was inviting me, high schools, NGOs, citizen committee. If I was able to do it, I was saying yes, because that was my way to contribute to what literally was the resistance of the French society to this terror attack. And the good news is that the French society reacted in the most positive way. It was not that visible because of the state of emergency. So, you know, French, in that circumstances, they go and they march in the streets, but that was impossible because of the state of emergency. But the way the society reacted, the way they foiled the jihadi plot that was aimed, I'm convinced, at generating sectarian strife in France, you know, community-based violence, and this didn't happen. And in fact, it was even more consensual than after Charlie Hebdo attacks 1 year ago, because Charlie Hebdo generated very divisive reactions in the French society, which was not the case after the massacre of Black Friday, November 13. But also, what I wanted to say in the book, and unfortunately this has been proven tragically right, is that our history is a shared history between the northern shore and the southern shore of the Mediterranean, for better or for worse. You know, in history is not a restaurant menu. You cannot pick this, change the sauce, make it rare or well done. It's impossible. It's like that. You have to accept it all. And this history, yes, and this history, you know, they say in France, le passé qui ne passe pas. You know, this past that people are not ready to accept. It's there, and we can still see, to make a very long story short, that the right wing in France, or right wing thinkers or politicians, have still a big problem with the colonial era in accepting that it was so destructive. But the left wing has still a big problem with the nationalist regimes that hijacked the independence in a cycle that I put from 49 to 69, from Hosni Zaim to Muammar Gaddafi. Hosni Zaim being an adventurer in his time, you know, the chief of staff of the Syrian army, defeated by the Israeli army, but defeating his own, you know, institution and people. And Muammar Gaddafi, at the end of the cycle, 20 years later, he had the candidness, because the guy was a rogue killer, but he was pretty candid, to say, oh, I could have become a civil servant, but I joined the army because I wanted to make a coup. Those people joined the military to make a coup. So, of course, that induced very specific relationship between the so-called national armies and the reality of the military cliques and their population. But my plea, my pledge, my thesis was to try and explain that what was happening in the Arab world since 2011 was not only the long-awaited sequel of deep, profound, sustained struggle for liberation. And if there is one Arab exception, I wouldn't say exceptionalism, that probably the Arab people have been the people on earth that have been faced with the worst oppression, occupation, violence every time they went out to claim their basic rights. In that case, yes, we can say there is an Arab exception, but this exception is coming from outside. It's certainly not coming from the roots of this society, and certainly not from Islam. And in '89, when the Berlin Wall fell, nobody in Europe would have been stupid enough, no matter how stereotypes about the Polish plumber or the Romanian beggars were still vivid, to say that what was happening in Eastern Europe was only the problem of the Eastern Europeans. Everybody understood it was our destiny, our common destiny of Europeans. I don't say we behaved wonderfully, perfectly, but certainly there was immediately a mobilization of all the means that were available at that time to help people to get out in the safest way possible out of decades of oppressions. That was not at all what happened in 2011. And when I heard for the first time the word Arab Spring, I knew we were bound to have an Islamist autumn and an integrist winter, because anyway, Islamist parties were going to win the first elections. There was no other alternatives. They were the best organized. They had the privilege of the repression, so they were like the martyrs, and they could provide answers both to the conservative part of the society by delivering some kind of moral order, but also to the revolutionary part of the society by pretending they were the only one able to manage a clear breakaway from the previous system. But in Europe, the answer was very tepid, not to say more. And until today, we're talking about Tunisia. When you imagine that Greece has received probably 1,000 times more European help than Tunisia just to stay in the Euro system, there is something really wrong. Because, you know, if Tunisia goes down, it's a European problem. So what I tried to explain is that this shared destiny, this shared history, for better for worse, in its luminous dimension, but also in its obscure, oppressive dimension, created a bound that is impossible to break. And you can build all the walls you want, you can do all the things you want in the Mediterranean. It's a shared future. But at the same time, my message of hope, and I will end on that rosy note, is that instead of pretending it's their problem, it's their history, it's their big mess, as though we would have nothing to do with this mess, that. And I'm not talking even about historical responsibility. It's a fact of life, We are bound, It's like that. So if we deny this bound, if we don't accept this continuity of history, this shared destiny, I insist on the word destiny, it's quite a strong word in the title, destin, then of course we will only see refugees and terrorists. But not only this denial will not stop the flow of refugees and terrorists, but it will make it even more dangerous, even more hysterical, by fostering the rise of the populist, nationalist, xenophobic forces in Europe as we see today, and not only in France. On the contrary, if we not only accept but live up to the expectation of this shared destiny, of this common future, if we accept, and if in the northern shore of the Mediterranean we consider that our destiny is bound to the freedom fighters, whether civilian, and most of them are civilian, but in some places they are military too, in the southern shore, then I'm sure the horizon of this common future could get clearer, and it's a moment of truth for the Arabs, obviously, but it has been for a while, and they felt pretty much left down and abandoned during the recent years. But it's certainly a moment of truth for Europe, and this is, by the way, what has said very forcefully the Prime Minister Manuel Valls in Davos today, among other things, saying Europe could get out of history if it doesn't live up to this expectation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jean-Pierre. Should we open things up to everyone else? So you'd like to ask questions or make some comments for Professor Filiu?
Maybe two questions. One, I travel a lot in West Africa and have seen developments in West Africa over the past 5 years, and I get very frustrated when I hear the analysis stopping at North Africa. I've also served in North Africa for 5 years, so I know North Africa. But it's going so much further. I mean, the scope of what we're seeing today is like big. It's going from it's involving the Middle East, it's involving North Africa, it's involving West Africa, it's also happening in Asia, but Asia is a different story. So I was wondering if you had any reflections on that. The other thing also, to any one of you, I was extremely interested in the remark that you opened with, when you said that the West never actually acknowledged, never even respected the Arabs enough to acknowledge that they can have a revolution, right? Their revolts. And you're right. I never thought about that, and it's so true. So if we go with that, would you say that the Palestinian revolution, actually in the 70s, was the only manifestation of what we had in the region as a possible real revolution? And within this revolution that was blooming in the 70s, there was some movements within the revolution that called attention to what was happening in Saudi Arabia and called attention to the importance of dealing with Saudi Arabia and the Wahhabism as part of the revolution. The revolution, the road to Jerusalem passes by Riyadh. We remember these slogans from the 70s. So what happened there?
Wow.
I put them up.
It's a big question.
No, I will be short on the second one, deferring to Rashid on that. For the first one, just one anecdote. I was lecturing in Nouakchott, Mauritania. It was the fall of 2011, and I was speaking about the Arab Revolution. And I saw a guy very excited on the first row, and he was the first one jumping to the microphone. He said, "I'm from Benin. Why should only the Arabs have revolution? We want revolution in Africa." I said, "Okay, welcome. It's far beyond my scope. But so certainly, but you see the specificity of the military regimes and of the Gulf autocracies that Rashid has described. You don't find it that way on the African or the sub-Saharan. Even Nigeria, it's not the same. And again, like always, I very clearly draw the red line of my limited capacities. I was recently in Sudan, for 10 days. Even there, I felt a little bit at home and a little bit offshore because I could not grasp all the concepts around. But certainly what is important is that 5 years ago, when this thing started, Arabs, for a brief fleeting moment, were the model and inspiration for many worldwide. In Zuccotti Park, you had something, it was written, here is the new Tahrir Square. The first time I see, American demonstration pretending they are Arabs, it was really impressive, And so, but you see, I think also that's why the repression was so big, so huge, so ferocious, because what was going on in the Arab world was not only the issue of the Arabs. It inspired many people in Madrid, in New York, in many places, occupying movement and things like that. And now it's impossible to occupy any square in the Arab world because the repressive apparatus have learned the lesson. So
Lebanon.
They will.
Except Lebanon.
Except, but even in Lebanon, when you do that, but that's Lebanon, they cancel the state. They suspend the state. There's no more state. The state goes on vacation. While in other places where you occupied, you're supposed to occupy because the state is still there. In Lebanon, when they occupied the center of Beirut, what was there? And it's finished. The state goes, escapes, dilutes into the clouds. It's very hairy, For the Palestinian revolution, and I insist on the revolution because we too often forget that for the Arabs as a whole, the Palestinians in particular, it was a Sawra, it was a revolution, and resistance and revolution were equivalent. They were equated. And certainly, not only, there are two, and I will stop with that and leave the floor to Rashid, but the fact that any Arab feels that the injustice inflicted on the Palestinian is a quintessential injustice. So they can really, relate to that intimately, you know. First thing. And second thing, it was after the, not after, but it was in the process, the sequel of the Arab Cold War, that was a way, because revolution in the Arab world had been suspended by this, you know, fighting of the titans, you know, between nationalism, and in fact it was a dead end. So the Palestinian movement was reopening the path to the revolution, which is why so many non-Palestinian Arabs joined the revolution. You know, now today people say, you know, jihadism in Tunisia. Hundreds of Tunisians joined the Palestinian revolutions, and sometimes at very high level, and even in the military wings at that time. So the idea is that in Tunisia, you had a longing for a transnational struggle that was territorialized because it's Palestine, but that was pan-Arab because it's Palestine, is nothing new. Nothing new. But on that,
yeah. No, that's true. There were many, many people in the early days of the Palestinian movement, the Palestinian Revolution. Many Egyptians, many Iraqis, many Syrians, many Lebanese, many North Africans, and people from farther afield, Turks and Armenians and so forth. It's actually a very good question why that revolutionary thrust dissipated. The easy answer is to say that some of the same processes that eroded the possibilities of democracy in other parts of the Arab world eroded the progressive and the democratic and the anti-monarchical trend of some of the groups that made up the Palestinian resistance. And you could almost see that process take place, the influence of oil money. And it wasn't only oil money from the reactionary Arab countries, which is to say the monarchies. It was also money, oil money, from the authoritarian dictatorships of Iraq and Libya. So that's part of it. These were not countries that fostered democracy. These were not countries that really had progressive values. And these were countries that the Palestinians depended upon, because the base of this movement was outside of Palestine, and they were therefore dependent on the kindness of strangers, to quote Blanche Dubois. And that was ultimately a terrible problem. And as Saudi Arabia became more and more the hegemon in the Arab world, and Egypt became less and less important, and as the Arab countries came to terms with Israel, began a process of resolution of their conflicts with Israel, and one by one made peace with Israel, the Palestinians were put in a much, much more difficult position. And then there were Palestinian mistakes. I mean, I've written about this. Very serious strategic mistakes in the 80s and in the 90s especially, which further weakened the Palestinian national movement. So that's a short answer to your question.
Hi, I just have a couple of questions I'd like to, about the Arab Spring that I'm trying to clarify. The first one is there a common political project stemming from the demand of the people during the Arab Spring, understanding that the Arab Spring is a continuous process despite some setbacks, like in Egypt? And if we can mention if movements for women's emancipation are significant to the Arab Spring as well. Thank you.
Very often I was asked, like, you know, it was some kind of riddle, but what do they really want? Which is always a question that strikes me, because the only answer I could deliver, the simple answer, they want to live a normal life. Because this is the answer I was given repeatedly, even under the bombings in Syria. I could even say, especially under the bombing in Syria. And the normal life became impossible under the Nizam, the system, because the regime per se was oppressing through the security services, through the corruption and all that. And the system was, in fact, invading the very private life. Okay, it could seem not very important, but if to join the university, if to have a job, if to open a shop, if you need a patron, or you even need to enter the one party or the ruling party. So they want to get rid of that. So what is sure is that this spontaneous claim we can conclude from this 5 years cycle that it's not enough to sustain a profound transition. So I am confident that new parties, new forms of organization will emerge. But already the striking dimension in what is happening, with the exception of Tunisia, because it's the only successful transition so far, is to give back power to grassroots or community-based organization. In fact, to reconstruct the society from below. So your question about women's emancipation, yes. So then women are obviously part of this movement. And they have been the first victims of the repression everywhere, starting with sexual repression or harassment, and it was not, spontaneous in Egypt. And with the state policy of massive rapes, whether in Libya before the fall of Gaddafi, or in Syria under the direct orders of the Assad regime. So we have reached a level of horror that means that we are talking about question of survival, even of this integrity of the women, which is of course not, which makes it very defensive and not very progressive. But I insist on two facts right now. First, the Tunisian constitution is one of the very few in the world, in fact I don't know another one, I'm sure there is no one like that in Europe, that pledge explicit full parity for all public office. It's far more advanced than the French constitution for that, I can tell you, with all the toilettage we are going to do to the French constitution. Nobody has ever proposed to put the parity in the French constitution, which could be a plus, by the way. The second thing is that my colleagues who are demographers, sorry, are now witnessing a phenomenon that they never experienced. Usually, when you have the fall in the fertility rate, it's irreversible. With the counter-revolution in the Arab world, the fertility rate is now going again up.
Really?
Especially in Yemen and in Egypt. It's a disaster. Because it's a disaster for the society, because that means, that means all the process induced by the fall of the fertility rate will be deconstructed. The participation of the women in the work labor market, the level of studies, and which led to the shrinking of the family model. Until today, in Tunisia, you make less children than in France. Which is also one of the reasons, on the top of the fact that there is no oil in Tunisia, that Tunisia could handle its transition in a reasonable way. But the demographers, who contrary to historians don't want to give cause to the process, they just want to examine the process, are very puzzled because they've never seen anything like that, with the exception of China, because of the reversal of the official policy. But this is probably the worst news from the Arab world right now. It has nothing to do again with Islam. It has nothing to do with the Arabness, and everything to do with the oppressive structure of the society, not only of the system. Because my interpretation, which of course demographers don't go because they don't interpret, is that this is a war natality. People make children because they are ready for war, whether social war or civil war. And it's not something that is dictated from the top. It is something that the society gets ready for. And unfortunately, we see war spreading all over those places that were hoping to achieve democratic transition.
If you're interested in the Tunisian constitution, the Michael Moore movie, What Country to Invade Next, has a section on how much more progressive the Tunisian constitution is than most other constitutions.
In accounting for the decrepitude, relative decrepitude of the Arab world, how do you strike the balance between external forces and internal forces?
Good question.
For example, the antagonism between Saudi Arabia and Iran attained a critical stage with the fall of Saddam Hussein after the U.S. invasion in 2003, the end of, I guess, 1,200 years of Sunni Arab rule, the ascendancy of Iran and the Shia in Iraq. And this raised the level to, unprecedented new level of tension. The whole, so-called Shia axis from Iran through Syria to Lebanon was, more strongly opposed by Saudi Arabia. I mean, the Middle East in general is viewed as the most subjugated subsystem in the international system. One could carry this analysis back, obviously. And that's, the 2003 invasion in particular is, the immediate cause of this whole thing, the destruction of the Iraqi state, the partial dissolution of Syria, and so on.
No, certainly, but the balance is, I wouldn't say it's easily struck, because it's a dialectics. All those anti-freedom system, oppressive system, dictatorships, autocracies are, as Rashid described it, totally integrated in the world system, and there is always an exchange of favors between this system as a whole and this local oppressive system. You cannot disconnect it. What was impressive in the Tunisian revolution and in the Egyptian revolution at the beginning was that they considered that despite this connection, they were able to take care of their own dictators without going after the external backers. I have been deputy chief of mission in Tunisia before leaving the diplomatic corps to academia. So I have a vague idea of how France was involved with Ben Ali's regime. Despite that, nobody burnt French flags during the revolution because that was not the issue. They didn't want, they say, one day we will speak about all that. Now we have a problem, we have a revolution. And it's not even that we are ready to forget or forgive, but what we want is you to support the revolution. And then we can speak about what we did in the past and so on and so forth. And it's quite fascinating because there could have been, like in neighboring Algeria, all the factors in order to say we defer, we postpone the revolution because we have the anti-colonial, anti-imperialist struggle to achieve, which would have been a denial of this freedom struggle of the very Tunisian people. But what is sure today, which is why I was insisting on the grassroots reality, is that the international system is now so intimately intertwined with those repressive apparatus that we really have, as Western powers or citizens or institutions, to go to the bottom, to go to the real people, the real society. Have no illusions. They are not nice society or nice people, but they are the one on which any future transition or any future at all can be based. I know it quite intimately and first-hand experience with Syria. And everything that is done yesterday in Geneva and Montreux, tomorrow in Vienna, is pointless because it doesn't address what the real people on the ground want. It's a construction. And a regime like the Assad regime, which is the father and with the son today, its only genius is how to create this web externally in order to erase or at least to deflect the impact of the reality on the ground. And you can see it, and you see it with Yemen today. We don't see the people anymore. We see the bombing, we see the war videos, but we don't see the people who are suffering right now. Or we see the refugees when the refugees can escape and reach the other shore. And this is very dangerous, and which is why I think everyone at his own level and with his capacity and should work to reopen channel with those people that we don't see anymore, because they are really the one on which any future can be based.
This is a very, very good question, this internal-external balance, and it's something that I struggle with when I teach the history of the modern history of the Middle East. And I mean, there's no short answer to this question. The answer has to be both. And the external factors are intertwined with the internal factors. I mean, one of the strengths of Daesh, one of the strengths of the Islamic State, is that they argue these states are all imbricated in this international system, are all held up by foreigners. And to some extent, that's true. The problem is it ignores the indigenous roots of autocracy in this region. States began in this region. Great states began in this region. Before most parts of the world had states, there were 1,000-year-old, 2,000-year-old states in Egypt and Mesopotamia. So there's a many thousand-year tradition of strong states, and in many cases of absolute states. When you look at how the attempts to establish a constitutional order in Egypt in the 1860s and 70s were foiled, you can talk about the British and the French, but you have to talk about the Khedive, you have to talk about the Egyptian aristocracy, you have to talk about a powerful tradition of a strong central state, you have to talk about the way the Ottoman Empire had helped to centralize certain aspects of governance to increase revenue flow and ensure food, but that in turn created a powerful state apparatus, even under the Mamluks, and this Muhammad Ali and the dynasty built on. So autocracy in Egypt is not something imposed from outside. It's something that has indigenous Egyptian roots. And you can see the same kind of thing in other parts of the Arab world and in other parts of the Middle East, in Iran, in Turkey, in the Arab countries. On the other hand, you have powerful aspirations for, as you said, for the people to rule. And that is broken out again and again and again in the Arab world. I mean, you gave the example of Tunisia. There are examples in Egypt, and there are other examples in other parts of the Middle East. It is the misfortune of the Middle East to be, as they say about Mexico, it's so near to the United States and so far from God. The Middle East is so near to these great powers and so important strategically that, exactly as you said, it is the most penetrated subsystem in the international system. That was L. Carl Brown, who we used to teach at Princeton, said this. And by penetrated, he meant the politics of these countries for generations have been infiltrated, suborned, affected by external factors because the region is so strategically important. And then, as an added curse, oil was discovered in commercial quantities in the early 20th century. And it became even more important and therefore even more penetrated. So it's both. There are internal and there are external factors. And the Cold War, exactly as you said, and as I write about in my book, made all of this worse.
So we'll take 2 more questions here and then at the back.
Well, actually, I have a question related to internal and external factors. A question that I heard from a number of political science American students. The question was, what should we do as Americans, as the students were asking about the American government, what should it do for Syrians who are oppressed and suffering, etc.?
Second, yes.
So we'll take the second question from the gentleman at the back as well, and then answer them together.
Just two very short questions. The expectations for the next scenarios in the different countries in the region. The second question is, what should be done to live? I'm an Egyptian, so what should be done to live in democratic countries? Just in a very practical way, some kind of recommendations for youth, for civil societies, for actors on the ground. What should be done?
Easy. No. You know, before going into politics, I think what is expected by the Arabs, I don't want to speak on their behalf because I'm not an Arab, but I heard it repeatedly, and again I heard it under the bombs in Syria and in other places. They would like a little bit of empathy. Like, you know, they are no different. You know, they have the same rights, the same aspirations, and they would like at least that basic fact to be acknowledged fully. And the moment this is done, this has profound political implications. And the idea of saying, we don't want to meddle in your business, okay, but I can tell you that any Tunisian, for instance, and I could speak about Syria for hours, will tell you we need your help. So I don't know how you call help meddling in the business, but it's certainly Tunisians don't want Europe to turn their back on them. They want Europe to be actively engaged. And they feel totally let down when Europe is just giving charity financing instead of the massive Marshall Plan they should have designed a long time ago in order to support Tunisian transition. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's the best I could deliver. And when it comes to Egypt, what can I tell you? You know, one man, one vote. You know, what can I tell you? Very basic thing. But there is a specificity in Egypt that was probably on top of everything that has been described by Rashid and those millenniums of autocracies, the poison inside the transition. You cannot do a revolution and keep the supreme judicial power in place. It's impossible. You cannot have a counter-revolutionary supreme law institution running a transition. It will kill it, and by the way, it killed it. You know, because at one moment it cancelled so many elections, so many laws, that there was a dead end, which was broke by Sisi's coup. But the people who created this big mess of judicial and constitutional dead ends were judges, were lawyers, judges, sorry, were judicial power. A Supreme Court that has been named by Mubarak in order for them to sanction the hereditary succession by his own son, Gamal. And those people were left in place. This is impossible. So the first thing to do is get rid of the Supreme Court.
I don't have any easy advice for what citizens should do. But one thing I will say is that those countries that have the freest systems right now in the Arab world. Tunisia and Lebanon are countries that have historically had not so strong states and have had strong civil societies. In the case of Tunisia, strong trade union movement. In the case of Lebanon, a very strong business class. They have many other characteristics that are different, but when the state is the arbiter of everything, including of resources, then it's a much more difficult process to change a system. I'm not advocating a Lebanese model or a Tunisian model, but I'm just observing that. And so the strength of civil society is one of the elements that to answer your question. I can't answer it, but that's the best I can. I think you answered your own question in what you were going to say, which is before you say what can we do, we should look back and say what have we done. And I think that's one of the things that Jean-Pierre is trying to do for French citizens in this book, to explain to them how historically France has helped to create the reality that France sees as a problem. This is not the Arabs who created the reality alone. It was France and the Arabs together who created their joint destiny. So you have Franco-Tunisians who are, in some cases, third-generation French citizens. They don't speak Arabic. They've never been to the Arab world. They don't know anything about the Arab world, but they're still treated as if they're immigrés. Well, that's a French problem, but it's born of a French interaction with the Arab world, which you talk about in this book. And I would apply a different set of analogous procedures to looking at Syria. Among the many problems in Syria is the state that you talk about, the core problem, in a way. That's what provoked a revolt. But other things also provoked a revolt. Other things also provoked the civil war. And like the Lebanese civil war, and like the Iraqi civil war, and like the Libyan civil war, and like the Yemeni civil war, these are not just civil wars. These are proxy wars. These are wars in which local factions are the pawns of external actors. Big external actors sometimes, Russia, Iran, Turkey. Small external actors sometimes, Qatar, the Emirates, and so on. And finally, they are part of a regional Cold War between the United States and Iran, and the United States and its allies and Iran, and between different Sunni powers with each other. If you go to a place like Libya, you will find the Emiratis and the Egyptians on one side, and the Qataris and the Turks on the other side. There's no Iran, there's no Shia, there's no Shia Crescent, and you have a proxy war being fought by local powers, in some cases acting out of understandable motives. I mean, Egypt borders Libya. It's a national security issue for Libya, for Egypt. But in some cases, for reasons that are completely inexplicable to anyone who doesn't understand the mentality of the autocrats of the Gulf, the psychology and the group mentality of a bunch of very, very powerful autocrats. This is a serious problem. And so what we have done is, some cases, it's not us in some cases. The United States has played a relative, and France for that matter, have played a relatively minor role in the Syrian civil war, partly because they have not been responsible in trying to end it. You could say that's their role. But these are allies of the United States or France, or these are countries that the United States or France or other have important relationships with. And so getting them to stop what they're doing would seem to be one of the things that we can do, and that means looking back and seeing what we have done. There are 4 of these wars now going on in the Middle East, and you should go back and look at the Lebanese template, where you had a 15-year civil war combined with massive external intervention by 2 huge military powers, Israel and Syria, and the PLO, a medium-sized military power, and proxy interventions by a dozen, at least, other countries. Iran under the Shah. One day, a mortar exploded in front of our house with the Saudi arsenal on it. Another day, a mortar exploded with the Iranian arsenal at the time of the Shah. 1976. But the Egyptians were sending weapons, the Iraqis were sending weapons, the Syrians were sending weapons, the Libyans were sending weapons, Soviet Union was sending weapons. There were a dozen countries, at least, involved in the Lebanese. Go back and look at that. Civil war, come proxy war, come external war, and you'll understand Iraq, and you'll understand Yemen, and you'll understand Libya, and you'll understand Syria. So, as you suggested, we should be looking back at this history, and for a change, we should learn from it.
Okay, so I think Rashid has just beautifully summed up some of the strengths of Jean-Pierre's book and why you should read it. And I can only endorse his earlier suggestion that if you don't know French, you could learn French too. As a member of the French department, I support that. Thank you very much, Jean-Pierre, Rashid, for this really thoughtful and rich discussion.
Il y a un collègue en moi de département d'histoire qui a fait